Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast for Bama 247. I'm your host, Cody Goodwin. Got a fun show for you guys today. We've got the whole gang back together. We're closer to 100% than we have been in recent shows, which is good considering it's Thursday. We're going to discuss the release of the second college football playoff rankings today, as well as the updated SEC standings, what those two pictures look like heading into the final 2 weeks of the regular season. We'll also touch on Alabama-Mercer, or as the EA College Football 25 video game refers to them as FCS Southeast. Go Pandas. If you know, you know. But first, I have a question for you guys. I was at CVS the other day. I was picking up some drugs for this head cold. I sound a little better, not a ton better. And faintly, over the speaker, I heard Christmas music. It's November 14th as we're recording this. Thanksgiving is the next major holiday on the calendar. My question is, when is it okay to start playing Christmas music?
It's a different question for my wife than it is for me.
Black Friday. Easy.
I'm in agreement with that. Alex?
I agree with that in theory, but in practice, it ends up in my house much earlier than that.
Why do we disrespect Thanksgiving so much? I don't like that.
Is Thanksgiving really a great holiday?
It's the best holiday.
Eh.
I stand on that.
Maybe it's because I've been covering college football too long and it just bleeds into another day in the season. It's just never really held a ton of charm for me.
I like the food. I like the fact that my entire family is around the table. I love the sides. I love the fact that you just sit and watch football all day. Like that is, I can't think of a more American holiday.
But you can get all those things absent football. Well, now you can get football on Christmas Day too. So it ends up where Christmas feels like a souped up version of Thanksgiving. It's thanks with presents. So, I mean, what's better than that?
I was taken aback. I don't listen to the radio nearly as much as I do anymore, or used to anymore. And you hear the jingle bells and it's just like, no, I don't like that. This is way too early.
Never heard that argument before.
I'm just saying, I don't know. I don't know that was something that we had discussed. I'm saving our Thanksgiving food takes for obviously a few weeks from now as we get closer to the actual holiday. But I heard that as I was picking up my drugs and I was just like, what in the world's going on here?
I actually like Christmas music. Like it doesn't bother me at all, especially like when we're talking about classics, like I can listen to that for weeks on end. So it doesn't really bother me like it does some people.
The assignment for you then, Alex, is to create a list of your favorite Christmas songs. And next month, when we have that discussion to open the podcast, I'm going to expect like power ratings.
I'll tell you I'll already tell you number one, because I did not know this song existed. And your kids, Mike, will love this song. Dominic the Donkey. If you have not heard that one yet, certified banger.
That was a deal. That was a big deal when I was a kid. I remember listening to that.
I somehow was my blind spot until about a year ago at this time. And I heard it and I was like, yeah, I'm in for this song.
I haven't heard that one yet. I'm gonna save it until Black Friday when it's a little bit more socially acceptable to blare Christmas music. Anyway, college football playoff rankings were released Tuesday, the second iteration. Not a ton of changes, but enough changes that I thought it was kind of interesting. We'll break this down. The top 15, I guess we'll just kind of keep it there since those seem to be the major players in this thing. Oregon at number 1, Ohio State at 2, Texas at 3, Penn State at 4, Indiana at 5. Real big SEC bias at the top of the college football playoff rankings, can't you tell? Number 6, BYU, 7, Tennessee, 8, Notre Dame, 9, Miami, 10, Alabama, 11, Ole Miss, 12, Georgia. Then you got Boise State at 13, SMU at 14, Texas A&M at 15. Then you've got a couple of Big 12 teams to maybe keep an eye on over the rest of the month, I suppose. K-State, Colorado at 16 and 17. If the playoffs were to start today, here's what the bracket would look like. You've got Oregon number 1 with a bye. They would get the winner of Tennessee, Notre Dame. That game would be in Knoxville. Miami number 4, they would get the winner of the 5-12 game, Ohio State, Boise State. That game would be in Columbus. Texas number 2, they'd get the winner of the 7-10, which is Indiana, Alabama. That game would be in Bloomington. And the 3 seed, BYU, they'd get the winner of 6-11, Penn State, Ole Miss. That game would be in Happy Valley. First 2 teams out, Georgia and SMU. Alex, since you've missed the last couple shows, I'll let you begin. Any thoughts, takeaways, hot takes? What do you think of the second college football playoff rankings?
It's hard for me to deliver a hot take because this is just what I've come to expect from the selection committee, which is just logic that's all over the place. We're going to overvalue Texas with no schedule, but we're going to ding Georgia for playing a hard schedule. Yet at the same time, we're not going to penalize Miami for playing a terrible schedule and losing one game. It's just all over the place to me. I mean, Texas's best win is Vanderbilt, which I know that stings for some Alabama fans, but it's just all over the place. My only hope is that some of this sorts itself out over the next 4 weeks. But I mean, it's not egregious. I just see the reaction inevitably on Tuesday night and everybody losing their mind and just going, how can we, this is the definition of insanity. We see the same thing and expect different results. It's just who they are.
Mike, do you have any sort of rebuttal, or what were your takeaways from the second release?
Well, I said this all along. I mean, they're still going to rank wins, basically, or rank losses, I should say, is really what it comes down to. I mean, that's what they've done. And we say they, like we say the selection committee, but really, as Reese Davis astutely pointed out on Tuesday night show, turns over 33% every year. It's only 3-year terms. So a third of the committee turns over every year. But as an institution, which has made up a lot of different people over the past 10 years that it's existed, that is what they tend to do. But it's tricky. I mean, it's like, how much do you penalize a team for going undefeated by not playing a hard schedule? How much do you reward a team for playing a hard schedule but losing games? Whether it's Georgia, or you can even make the case for Florida. Florida's one of the hardest schedules in the country. They played Georgia close for a while. They have 5 losses, but they've played a lot of hard teams. Do you rank teams by who they've beaten? Because Indiana, hasn't beaten anybody besides Michigan. Texas hasn't beaten anybody. But you know who's beaten somebody? Vanderbilt. You know who's beaten somebody? Kentucky. They beat Ole Miss. There's no perfect way of doing it. And I don't think anybody would sit here and argue Kentucky deserves to be in the playoff because they beat Ole Miss. And Indiana doesn't deserve to be in the playoff because they didn't beat anybody. Now, in terms of seeding, you can make arguments that Alabama should be higher. I think that was probably the most surprising thing to me. I thought, both polls had them at 9 ahead of Miami. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where Alabama and Miami are head to head. I mean, Miami's going to jump them and get a first round bye if they win their ACC. If they don't win the ACC, then they're out. So that comparison really doesn't matter at the end of the day. Maybe you can make the argument between Alabama and Notre Dame, Alabama and BYU, Alabama and Indiana, Alabama and Penn State. Hell, even Alabama and Texas. There's no perfect way of doing it. And until there's some system in college football where everybody has relatively equal schedules and there's not the freedom of choice from each school to just go out and pick their opponents, professional sports leagues don't do that. The whole idea of I'm going to call up USF and say, hey, do you want to play a game against me, is dumb. It's a stupid idea. And it's just how college football has operated for a century or more, but it needs to go away. There needs to be a central body that tells you who you're playing, not just your conference games, but all of your games. And if it's SEC and Big Ten becoming right, that's the central body. Let's be real.
For those who are just listening, Alex held up a ESPN sign.
Mike Flag,
Right. So that is where it needs to go if you want to solve these problems. Otherwise, if you give schools the freedom of choice, which is an absurd concept, but a relic of college football past, then this is what you get.
So you're saying that college football needs to veer more toward, at least when it comes to scheduling, what the NFL does.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can see this happening, the SEC and the Big Ten combining forces and creating something, whether it's official or unofficial, or whether they're the same league one day, a scheduling agreement where essentially you're playing 8 or 9 SEC games, and then you're playing 1 or 2 against a Big Ten team, and maybe you get to pick one opponent outside of that. But personally, I don't think that should be the case. I think you should play 10 SEC teams and 2 Big Ten teams and call it a day. And so all the schools that collect the check, the Mercers and ULMs and Western Kentuckies of the world, too bad. Like, that's where this needs to go. But if you continue to cater to, we need to give a check every year to those schools, then you're going to retain the freedom of choice. You're going to retain the ability for Indiana to schedule the way they do versus Alabama scheduling the way they, versus all these schools doing it different ways. Like, that's how you solve it. And it's not also not Indiana's fault that the Big Ten scheduled their schedule the way they did, but Indiana also has to go to Ohio State. Like, that's as hard as it gets in the Big Ten. So that's not the easiest schedule alone.
If the selection committee had 10 years of showing us that it values strength of schedule, that would change things. But again, they don't. They don't follow through on that promise. So without that, without a central authority to guide these things, you do get where it's all over the place. You do get these situations where if you're an AD, I hate it, but if I'm an AD, why in the hell would I schedule a difficult out-of-conference schedule? Especially in the SEC. I'm already guaranteed I'm going to play 3 to 4 top 25 teams. Why would I throw another potential one on top of that, knowing that the committee hates losses more than it likes strength of schedule? So unless and until a selection committee says, you know what, a 2-loss Georgia is better than a no-loss Indiana or a 1-loss Indiana or whatever it is. I'm not trying to pick on Indiana. But like, until they do that and send that message, it's all moot point.
Mm-hmm. And look, there are metrics that can help you try to sort through some of that. I think strength of record is probably the closest that we have, being defined by ESPN as, where is it? Strength of record reflects the chance that an average top 25 team would have the team's record or better given the schedule.
Yeah.
But that's the metric that I think gets you to that point. Where, by the way, Alabama is still behind Miami and Indiana and Penn State in terms of their strength of record ranking. Indiana is number 6 in the country in strength of record. So there's different ways of doing it. I think I don't jump on the bandwagon of hating the committee just because I think they have a hard job.
You know what the committee needs to do? They need to stop explaining themselves. Because every time the Ward Manual or Kirk Honeycutt, whatever, all these guys go on and they become a mouthpiece because they're not actually the ones making the decision in a lot of cases. They're just the ones relaying the reasoning, and the reasoning is all over the place, and it makes it even worse. You don't see the AP Top 25 and come out, and then Bob Holt does a webinar with all of us and says why the AP Top 25 voted the way it did. Just release the rankings, let everybody get pissed off, and move on. Like, the rankings are broken in a lot of ways, but the explanation of it makes people even angrier, and for good reason, because you got Ward Manuel going up there and saying that a loss is quality to Michigan because Michigan's good up front. No, they're not. Like, stop saying these things. That's the other thing that bothers me. A lot of bothers me about it, but yeah, it's the explanation part of it. Just cut it out. I know it's great TV, I guess, but shit.
Look, and as far as like what to make it specific about Alabama, like, they're in a spot now where, and we talked about on the last show or 2 shows ago about some of the SEC championship game stuff. We can all circle back there, but in terms of Alabama's question right now is, do they host a playoff game or are they having to go on the road? And for right now, it's going to be tough for them to move up too much more because of their schedule. They have Mercer, Oklahoma, and Auburn. You're not going to score any big points with the committee by beating any of those teams. If you lose, then you're out. So, and if you don't play, there's still like a style points conversation, I think, to have with Alabama. If you mess around with Oklahoma and Auburn, play with your food, as our host likes to say, then I think that's going to hurt you a little bit in terms of the eyes of the committee. If you come out and play like you did against LSU and just don't make it a game, that's probably going to help you a little bit. But again, Miami and BYU don't really matter. They're ahead of Alabama, but they don't matter because if they win their conferences, they're going to be ahead of Alabama. It's really a conversation between Notre Dame, Indiana, Penn State, maybe Tennessee. And that's where you get into some of the back and forth of different metrics. So like Tennessee's strength of schedule is pretty good. It's 13th in the country. Alabama is number 2. I mean, that's the other thing. There's a bunch of different ways to calculate strength of schedule. There's not one centralized like rule on what strength of schedule is. It's all based on however you rank the teams to begin with. So that determines how hard your schedule is. And it's very circular. Like if you're playing Indiana, are they a hard team? Well, if you're saying they don't play a hard schedule, then maybe they're not a good team. It becomes very like, how do you rank the teams before you rank the teams? Essentially, it's a very difficult exercise, and you're going to get 20 different results in terms of strength of schedule. But Tennessee has a pretty good schedule. They might lose to Georgia this week. And if they're a 2-loss team that lost to Georgia on the road versus an Alabama team that's 2 losses, beat Georgia at home, does that suddenly make Alabama better? Or I think the committee is probably going to stick with head-to-head. Like you can kind of open each door and which one do you want to open and make most important? To me, I think Tennessee stays ahead of Alabama. Penn State's not really going to go anywhere. Like they're not going to Indianapolis for the Big Ten championship unless Ohio State messes up here. And their schedule is not very tough the rest of the way. They're just going to sit there as a 1-loss team that lost close at home to Ohio State. And they're probably ahead of Alabama. Indiana, I think, is the bigger question. It depends on how they play at Ohio State. If they keep it close on the road against Ohio State, and that's their only loss, I think there's going to be an argument that they should stay ahead of Alabama in the rankings. And then you have Notre Dame, which has a terrible loss, the worst loss of any team out there. But they have a win at Texas A&M. They could beat a top 25 team in Army. They could go on the road and beat a decent USC team in a couple of weeks. Like they're not terrible. And they might stay ahead of Alabama. So the opportunity for Alabama to move up much further without winning the SEC in order for them to host a playoff game, I don't know. It's there, but it's not. It's a pretty narrow path for them right now, I think, to actually host a game in Tuscaloosa.
To me, I don't see that as that big of a deal. Because honestly, like, I don't know. When it comes to these rankings, I really truly dive in and start paying attention when it's the one before the regular season finale, the one before conference championship weekend. Like those are the ones where it's like, okay, what are the possible dominoes that could fall for potential movement here? Honestly, my first reaction when I saw the rankings come out and I saw them put the bracket together was like, dude, if I'm Alabama, I think I'd take that path in a heartbeat, right? Because yes, you have to go on the road to Bloomington, but you're playing an Indiana team that, yes, has beat up on a bunch of bad teams, but is still, I think, largely unproven. And then the winner goes to play Texas in what would be New Orleans in a neutral site game in the national quarterfinals. And I think I like my chances with that. And then after that, you're looking at potentially BYU, Penn State, or Ole Miss in the semifinals if you can get that far. Like I kind of like that path for the Tide to get potentially all the way if that bracket holds. We know it won't. There's a lot of dominoes that need to fall and a lot of games that still need to be played to flush a lot of this stuff out. But
I just didn't pay that much attention to it because I think that's going to change so much. The actual path, like where you're playing in the first round. I think to me, it's the question of are you hosting versus are you going on the road, I think is the more approachable question at this point in where we're at.
When we're talking about the 3 scenarios, going on the road in a first round, hosting, or having a first round bye, which is the least likely scenario? Because in some ways, I think hosting a first round game is the least likely.
I agree. And of those 3, it's the least likely. And I would say it's also potentially the best path, especially if you're the number 5 seed, because then you get the number 4 seed, the lowest ranked of those first round buys. I don't think Alabama is going to be able to get up that far unless some weird stuff happens. That would be, to me, the preferred scenario is to host as like a 5 seed, and then you have an easier game in the Sugar Bowl. Or it wouldn't be the Sugar Bowl. It'll be wherever the 4 seed is playing. It might be whatever the hell it is. Would have to look at Brett McMurphy's tweets. There
are some conference ties with the
right. There's still some conference tie-ins with those quarterfinal games. But to me, it's in terms of the likeliest scenarios, it's between, I feel like Nick Saban when he talks with his hands. I've just watched hours and hours of Nick Saban in my life.
The world should see Mike Rodex YouTube TV recordings. It's absurd.
It's between going to the SEC championship game and going on the road in the first round. And I know that there's this idea out there, and we've discussed it, like where it might be better to not play interconference championship game. And I think that it might apply to some scenarios. I think it probably applies to a school like Penn State more than anybody else this year. But for Alabama, I still am on the line of thinking that it's a better path for Alabama to get into the SEC championship game, to play either Texas or Texas A&M on a neutral field in Atlanta, where I think you can have a pretty favorable crowd over either one of those schools. And then you're playing for the chance in the quarterfinals. If you go on the road in the first round, the upside's the same. You're playing for a spot in the quarterfinals, but it's a tougher environment, especially if you're going to an Oregon, to a Columbus, if it's the loser of the Big Ten championship game. If you're going to Penn State, you're dealing with potential for weather in a lot of those places, whether it's snow or cold, or, a crowd that has never, the chance to have a night playoff game against Alabama in December is going to get some people riled up. That's a tough deal. And to me, the upside's the same. Whether you play in the SEC championship game, whether you play in a first round playoff game, the result is the same. You are playing for a spot in the quarterfinals. The downside to me is worse playing in the first round playoff game on the road, because you lose that game, you're out of the playoffs. You're done. Your season's over. If you lose the SEC championship game, you might still have a shot to get in as a 3-loss team. Depending on how that game goes, depending on everything else, you still theoretically have a shot. So the upside's the same. The downside is different. And to me, I would take the scenario where the downside is higher, going to the SEC championship game, on top of the reason that I think it's an easier game situationally, circumstantially, where you're playing with the crowd, with the weather, to go to Atlanta and do that than try to do it in Eugene, Oregon, or Columbus, or State College, or someplace like that. That's where I stand on it. But I know people have different opinions.
No, I think I've come around to that idea that if they get to the SEC championship game, and we'll touch on that here in just a second, that's effectively your first round playoff game.
Mm-hmm.
Like, maybe if you lose, you could potentially get in, but if you win that, then you're in the quarterfinal. And I believe the SEC tie is with the Sugar Bowl. So then you'd go to New Orleans, where that's an easy travel destination as well. You could have another, I don't want to say home game, but like, there's going to be a lot of Alabama fans that make their way to New Orleans for that game.
Right. And it comes down to, like, how much do you value the idea of we made the playoffs this year? Like, we're a playoff team, versus going to the SEC championship game. You might have the chance to say we're the SEC champions. Because I think if your priority perception wise of your program is to say we are a playoff team last year, then maybe it's better to go play a first round playoff game. You might lose, but to me, like, if your priority is to make it as far as you can in the playoffs, then I think going through the SEC championship game is still the best way to do that.
It's the cleanest path, but the thing that worries me is the attrition part of it, and whether you sustain an injury in that game. If you lose the game, you're turning around in 2 weeks and playing in the same scenario where if you didn't play the game, have 3 full weeks to prepare. You're in the same spot. You're assuming a loss versus a win there. The cleanest route is obviously to go to the SEC championship, win, and have a first round bye. But I do think there's something to be said for the extra time off and not having a potential ding on the resume, because if you lose big, I don't know that you're in. That's the thing. Like, if you lose by 2 touchdowns and there's some other team sitting on the bubble that didn't play, I think the committee's I think there's a chance they're going to look favorably on that.
Right. But if you lose by a touchdown, a point, a field goal, 3 touchdowns, whatever, in your first round playoff game, you're still not going to the quarterfinals. So it's like, if your goal is to get to the quarterfinals, get to the semifinals, I think it's just you're choosing different paths. And I think in this particular season, knowing that if Alabama makes the SEC championship game, which it would if everything is chalk, if all the favorites win the rest of the year in the SEC, then Alabama will be going to the SEC championship game. And it would be against Texas or Texas A&M, the winner of that game. And I think especially if A&M wins that game, I think they're a very beatable team for Alabama. I think Texas is still a beatable team, but I think they're a better team than A&M. So to me, that's the better path in this particular season. Now, if it was last year or 2 years ago, and you're talking about the prospect of trying to go through Atlanta and play Georgia, and Georgia is just a behemoth like they were previously, past tense, then that's a different question. And maybe I would take my chances going on the road to Timbuktu than trying to do, what you did against Georgia and Atlanta. Although I say that knowing that Alabama has had a lot of success playing Georgia in Atlanta. But I think just from a playing the odds standpoint, I would lean towards this year in this scenario going to Atlanta.
To put a bow on it, I do wonder 5 years from now how fans are going to feel about the prospect of winning a conference championship versus losing your first game in the playoff. Which one's going to matter more? Because I think there's going to be a segment that says just getting in is not enough. And winning a conference championship is going to be devalued.
I think it comes down to, I agree. I think it's going to happen like that because you can look at any pro sport that has the same sort of system. In that case, it's not your conference, it's your division, whether it's in the NFL or baseball or basketball or whatever. And does anybody remember who won the AL Central last year? I don't know. But you just remember who won the World Series. Dodgers won the World Series. The Yankees were in the World Series. Division winners don't really matter. And there's been teams in the NFL who have been wild cards who have advanced through and gone to the Super Bowl, and teams that have won divisions that have that long time off, and they go and they lose in the first playoff game that they play. So I agree. I think that's going to happen. But as long as the SEC can make a profit off of the game in Atlanta, I think they're going to continue to collect that check.
To hammer the point home, it was Cleveland that won the AL Central this year. I think that's a good transition into the SEC standings. Wanted to take a peek at this with 3 weeks left. 3 teams with 1 loss in conference play. That's Tennessee, A&M, and Texas. Currently 5 teams with 2 losses: Georgia, Ole Miss, Alabama, Mizzou, and LSU. Week 12 games of note. Obviously, the biggest one is Tennessee at Georgia, but then you've also got Mizzou at South Carolina, LSU at Florida, Texas at Arkansas. That Tennessee-Georgia game, it's interesting, right? Because Georgia is clearly not, I think, the same team that Alabama beat way back when, but also Alabama probably needs them to beat Tennessee in order for all of this to fall their way, right? If Tennessee wins, they stay with 1 loss. They kind of eliminate Georgia, both from potentially Atlanta and I think from the college football playoff altogether. That also ensures that there's still 3 one-loss teams in the SEC, and you're going to need a domino that shouldn't fall over the last 3 weeks if Alabama wants to make a true run at Atlanta. That's obviously the big game to watch there. What do we think about that matchup? Do we want to discuss it? We don't need to discuss it in any, I think, length, but obviously it's a big one that a lot of Alabama fans are going to keep an eye on this weekend.
My only analysis is outside of the SEC championship scope, which is if Carson Beck has another lackluster game, what does Kirby Smart do long term about the quarterback position? Because I think
long term, there's 3 weeks left.
Does Carson Beck look like a first round pick right now?
No.
They're a program that's at a little bit of a crossroads. But at the same time, you're thinking, is Nico even going to play in this game? So I feel like there's a reason for hope if you're Georgia, but they're skating on awfully thin ice.
Right.
I don't even think Nico matters as much as just Beck doesn't look good. And now he's got to play and I've said this before on the show, he's got to play the best defense in the country in Tennessee. I know the game's in Athens, but bruh.
I don't know if it's an elimination game. It obviously isn't for Tennessee because I think they can lose to Georgia on the road. As long as they don't get boat raced, then I think they're pretty comfortably in still, as long as they beat Vandy on the road. I mean, it's on the road. It's 2 hours from Knoxville. There's going to be, I'm sure, a lot of Tennessee fans there. So as long as they do that, I think Tennessee's fine, even with the loss. Georgia is still, if there's going to be a 3-loss team that gets in, it's either going to be Georgia or it's going to be in Alabama that goes to the SEC championship game and loses. And I don't know what it would take around them for all that to happen. I think it would take still some weird stuff. But if there was going to be a 3-loss team, Georgia would still be in the driver's seat to do that because of their schedule and because of their win over Texas, which is on the road and still a pretty big win. So
don't forget the Clemson win to start the year. That still looks pretty good.
Yeah. So, I mean, their resume is not bad, but I think it still would take a lot around them. So I would hesitate to call this an elimination game for Georgia. It definitely is not for Tennessee. At the end of the day, I agree with Alex. My main interest in this game is just if Tennessee wins, then Alabama's path to the SEC championship game is blocked, unless Vandy comes up with something. So it would be Tennessee versus the winner of Texas A&M, more than likely. But if Tennessee loses, then Alabama is really in a position to go to Atlanta.
The path potentially, if Tennessee were to win, would be for Auburn to beat A&M, not this weekend, but next weekend, and then for A&M to beat Texas. According to our friends at notnothing.net, that would make it Tennessee, Alabama, and Atlanta for the SEC championship game. So we'll see which version of A&M shows up at Jordan-Hare, if that's what if Tennessee is ultimately able to win this game, which I don't know, man. Like I trust the Vols defense. I think of the four key units that are going to play in that game, I think I trust the Vols defense a lot more than I trust any of the other three. And them up against Carson Beck, I don't know. I
don't really care. I don't know if that's like the right way of putting it, but like I'll watch it. Maybe. I mean, what time is that game?
That's the 6:30 game on ABC, right?
So we'll be probably just wrapping up with covering Mercer. Like at the end of the day, it only affects my travel plans and whether I go to Atlanta or not. Like I don't have an emotional investment in Tennessee, Georgia. I don't think Alabama fans should either. I know Alabama fans like love to root against certain teams and you want to see Georgia lose, but I don't think there's really like a team in that game that you really need to root against or root for in Alabama's case.
No, but like I think the clearer path to Atlanta involves Georgia beating Tennessee.
Right. And then there's a whole line of thinking you don't want to go to Atlanta. I think fans will look at it that way too, where they're rooting for Tennessee to win, so Alabama doesn't have to go there. Like I think we'll see some of that as well.
Do any of the other SEC matchups, that LSU at Florida, Texas at Arkansas, any of those pique your guys' interest or no?
It just piques my interest from the standpoint of what LSU can do. That is just hilarious, but it still exists where LSU, again, if everything's chalk, Alabama goes to Atlanta. If everything's chalk except for Arkansas beating Missouri the last week of the season, then LSU goes to Atlanta over Alabama because of the common opponent's tiebreaker. And the Alabama-LSU head-to-head loss does not come into play because it's a 6-way tiebreaker for second place. All 6 teams did not play each other. Therefore, head-to-head does not matter. That, requires LSU winning against Florida. That doesn't require, but I think if LSU's path is to happen, South Carolina beating Missouri is a good result for them. That's the only reason those games would intrigue me, just because I think it's hilarious that LSU could lose to Alabama and then make the SEC championship game over Alabama. That's just downright hilarious to me, but it's very possible. It's just silly, but it's there. It exists. Like we have to look at it.
That's a good description for college football in 2024. It's just silly,
but it's
just silly. The whole enterprise, just really, really silly. Speaking of silly, Alabama-Mercer this Saturday, 1 p.m. You can only watch it on ESPN Plus, Bryant-Denny Stadium in Tuscaloosa. Alex, I'll let you start. What would you like to see in this game on Saturday?
You start off with no injuries, right? I think that's place important to start. Don't, again, we'll use it again. Don't play with your food. Get it over with early and let the second and third string go out there and get the reps they need to get. And then beyond that, you're just looking to see, okay, how does Ty Simpson function in an offense where he's not just simply handing the ball off? How do guys like Zay Mincy look putting in reps at safety as opposed to cornerback? There are things getting out of the election season down ballot that you're interested in, but the top of the ticket is not really that big of a concern for this game. Everyone can knock on wood, but yeah, Mercer's a good team, but they compete in the FCS for a reason. It's a different quality of football. So again, looking at more second, third string and how can those guys take those opportunities to develop, because they have been few, because Alabama did not take care of business against South Florida, did not take care of business against Vanderbilt, those games where you expect to have those moments. This is one, and you need to take advantage of it.
Yeah, I think the way we made this game interesting in the offseason when we were discussing the schedule, and I think this was during the schedule draft, the way we made the Mercer game interesting was that we wanted to see each quarterback get a quarter, right? So like Milroe and the ones take care of the first quarter. Ty Simpson and the ones and twos take care of the second quarter. Austin Mack, Dylan Lonergan get the second half with a lot of the twos, threes, and fours. That to me, I think would be interesting. That's also something I would like to see in this game. I'm not sure that we're going to get it exactly as cleanly as that, but I do agree that let's see what some of the 2s and 3s and 4s can do. Let's see Richard Young get 10, 15 carries in this game. Let's see Dan Mountain, score another rushing touchdown. Let's see Caleb Odom finally get a red zone target. Let's see Zay Mincy go out there and play. Justin Okoronkwo, let's see him go out there and play. I think James Smith has become a pretty key part of the defensive line rotation, but I'd like to see him a little bit earlier in this game. Let's see him wreck some stuff. Mike, what would you like to see in this game against a Mercer team that you've done quite a bit of research on this week, 9-1, number 9 in the FCS coaches poll? But what would you like to see from Alabama on Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, I always expect to see like, oh, we're going to be talking about the backup quarterback and all that. And then I feel like I've been sitting there in the press box in the third quarter of these games against Chattanooga or Mercer or whoever the hell it's been, UT Martin. And you're like, well, Bryce Young's still in the game. It's the third quarter. And that maybe that was just the way Saban operated. Like he really liked to keep those guys in there. I don't know if it'll be the same for this sort of game under Kalen DeBoer. But I always feel like I'm disappointed when I have all these expectations of I'm going to see all these players in a game. And then, yeah, you might see some of them, but like if Dylan Lonergan or Austin Max in the game, guess what? They're going to be handing the ball off. Like, I hate to say it, but that's what they're going to be doing. We're going to be watching a fourth quarter of just handoff. That's what it's going to be. So it's keep your expectations in check.
I'm going to set a line here. 5.5 passing attempts from Austin Mack. Over under.
Under.
That's a good line because I'm tempted to say under, but I can see it going over. Because I don't think you truly call the dogs off until the fourth quarter. I think that's when it is kind of uncouth to be throwing the football around very much. But I could also kind of see him breaking that.
I'd like to see the puppies run the first team offense. Let's get the young guys out there and let's see what they can do.
I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. I think once Milroe comes out, the first team offense they're not going to put Ryan Williams out there.
No.
Yeah. They're not going to put Bernard, Tyler Booker. I mean, Roberts is already dealing with an injury.
But give me Austin Mack chucking it to Rico Scott down the sideline. Like I want to see
it'll be
that.
better than what Austin Mack had to do in the spring game, which is throw it to a bunch of walk-ons. I think it'll be improved from that.
Right. But look, I mean, to me, I think don't give Mercer any hope because I do think Kalen DeBoer is being truthful when he says like Mercer is coming in with a lot of confidence. Like they are a 9-1 team. I'm sure they see themselves as potentially being able to make some noise in this game. And they're number 1 in a ton of categories. They're number 1 in defensive touchdowns in the FCS. They're number 1 in sacks in the FCS. They are number 1 by interceptions in the FCS by a wide margin. They have 2 players with 6 interceptions. There's nobody else that has more than 4 in that entire league. They are number 1 in third down defense in FCS. They are up there in basically tackles for loss. They're number 1 in the FCS. So don't allow those guys to make a play against you because I think that gives them a little bit of confidence, whether it's Milroe making a bad throw or something happening and they're not going to be running an option offense. Like the Citadel game in 2018 where the Citadel came in, kept running the option offense. Alabama didn't know how to defend it. Kind of like the Vandy game. That's not what Mercer's offense looks like. Cause I've just grinded the film this week on Mercer and it's a lot of RPO stuff. It's a lot of RPO. So they're not going to be coming in there and running a triple option. And in fact, their starting quarterback's hurt. DJ Smith, he's day to day with an injury. So they have a backup.
Do they have an injury report?
No, their coach, Mike Jacobs, had a press conference with, I think it was one guy asking questions the other day. It's not going to be like a weird gimmicky, like option offense that screws with them. I think it's the possibility offensively for Mercer to throw the ball would be their route. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's more about Mercer's defense against Alabama. And if Alabama just screws up here and there, I think Mercer's defense does have some capability to take advantage of that and not just let Alabama go down, touchdown, the first 6 drives of the game.
To drive that point home, I know I made reference to the FCS Southeast Pandas earlier in the show because Mercer is not in the video game. But I ran the sim last night. We're recording this on Thursday. I ran the sim Wednesday. Alabama won 49-7, but Mercer / FCS Southeast, their 7 points came on a pick 6. So, hey, there's the video game might be onto something there.
They lead FCS in defensive touchdowns with 6 this year.
Not bad. That's all we've got today on this show, guys. We'll be back Sunday to discuss whatever happens in the Alabama-Mercer game, as well as whatever else happens around the SEC and what it means for the Tide and potentially the next edition of the college football playoff rankings. The SEC championship game race will be, again, Sunday to discuss all of that. The game Saturday, 1 p.m. start time, and you can only watch it on ESPN Plus. So get your subscriptions ready. In the meantime, be sure to rate and review the show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 24/7 Sports to get all of our great coverage on the Crimson Tide. There's a lot going on right now, both with football and basketball. Who plays at Purdue on Friday? Maybe we'll touch on that game a little bit. If not on Sunday, then later in the week. So yeah, come along and enjoy the ride with us. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening. We'll talk to you all again soon.